So like I said before, what we're doing today is we're just going to be continuing with this scenario. Hopefully those of you who came in a bit early or came in on time, you had a chance to answer these two questions that I've projected on the screen. The first question being, identify the sample of participants that were used in this experiment. So remember, the sample of participants are the specific people who are involved in the research study or in the experiment. Okay, so if you read through this scenario, you should have been able to identify that this was 100 healthy adults from that university where the lecturer had taught. Okay, so that should be your answer there. Okay, how you can spot what the sample is just look for a number of participants, okay, and any extra information. So we know they're 100 healthy adults and we know that they're at a university level, or that's kind of the age that we're looking at there. Okay, you could have even said 100 healthy adults who were in university aged between 18 to 40. You could mention that if you want, but again, that's just being really, really specific. So if you want to take your answer to the next level, you can mention the age as well, but not really, really compulsory in this case to get the 1 mark. Okay, so that's the basic idea. That gives us information about the sample of participants, which are basically the people who actually took part in the study. Okay, that's our sample. And the population is just the broader group from which that sample was drawn. So in this case, the population would just be all the students at the university. Okay, and these 100 are the specific sample that were drawn from that broader population. Alrighty. What do we think, guys? What do we think the sampling procedure is? Given that we've learned about a few different types of sampling, like random sampling, convenient sampling, stratified sampling. Reading the scenario, what do you think the sampling procedure was that was used in this experiment? If anyone can name it in the chat box, if you know. Have a read through the scenario again, particularly this paragraph, and even just take a guess as to what sampling procedure has been used. Yeah, convenience, excellent, good work. So convenient sampling is the sampling procedure that's been used. So I'll just project that so everyone can see. Convenient sampling was used, and we know that convenient sampling was used because if we read that specific paragraph, you can see that she selected 100 healthy adults from the university where she was a lecturer. It's just like if I was to do an experiment and I chose you guys to be my participants because I teach you guys, and it's easy for me to access you as participants rather than going outside of school and accessing a whole other group of people. So because it's easy for the lecturer to access her participants since they're her university students, we say that convenient sampling was used. And convenient sampling is obviously easy, but it comes with that drawback. We know that not everyone had an equal chance of being selected there. So only her students were being selected for the study, but there's no indication that it's been randomized. So not everyone at the university had an equal chance of being selected there. So that's how we know that convenient sampling was used. Alrighty, so that's good. Let's move on to the next question. This one's a little bit more tricky, but see how you go. We're talking about operationalizing the IV and DV here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock. Okay, and your time starts now. Okay, so when we're talking about operationalized IV and DV, we are basically just, comparing those variables. So we're just writing the normal IV and the normal DV, and then we're just writing how they are operationalized, or in other words, how they're measured. Because remember, that's what operationalized means. It means how we're measuring that specific variable. And we talked about this when we did research methods earlier in the year. We said that for any one variable, we can measure it in different ways. For example, in this study, the researcher is very much interested in measuring the participants' weight, We know we can measure a person's weight in kilograms, but we can also measure weight gain in terms of waist circumference. Okay, so we can measure how much inches a person has gained around their waist, and we can use that as an indication that a person has gained weight. Okay, we can use self-reports to ask the participant, do you feel like you've gained weight in the past few months? Okay, and people might say, yeah, my jeans feel a little bit tighter, you know, my clothes feel a little bit less loose than they were before. So there are many ways that we can measure weight, but in this example, the lecturer has just decided to just put them on a weighing scale and weigh them in terms of kilograms. So I'll just show you guys the answer. As you can see, the operationalized DV is weight gain as measured by calculating the change in kilograms of the participant's weight pre and post experiment, and the operationalized IV is sleep deprivation as measured by whether participants have their sleep time reduced to 5 hours per night. Okay, we say that's the operationalized IV because the operationalized IV applies to the experimental group. Remember, the experimental group are the main people who are exposed to the IV. So whatever information is attached to them, that's the information that will go into our operationalized IV there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. All that information, all those numbers, all those indications were given in the scenario. It was just a matter of you putting 2 and 2 together and just writing that in the answer. Okay, if you guys don't have any issues with this, we can continue moving on to the next question. But if you have any confusions, let me know. The way that this question is marked, it's out of 4 marks, but it doesn't mean you have to write a lot. You just get 1 mark for naming the non-operationalized IV, 1 mark for non-operationalized DV. So even if you didn't operationalize these variables and you just wrote the simple IV and the simple DV, you'd still get 2 marks out of 4, which is still pretty good, better than writing nothing. Okay, obviously the other 2 marks come from the information in the bracket, so operationalizing that variable there. Okay, and remember, you always get the information to operationalize variables within the actual scenario, so you'll always be given those clues there. Okay, you'll never be kind of asked to make that up yourself. Okay, now let's write a research hypothesis. It's worth 4 marks now. So just have a look through the scenario again. It's pasted on this slide, and use that iPod C structure, starting with those 4 words, it was hypothesized that, or it is hypothesized that, and see how you go. So what I'll do is I'll put about, let's see, how much time? Maybe 3 minutes, because hypotheses can be a bit time consuming. So I'll put 3 minutes on the clock to write this hypothesis, and your time starts now. Resume. All right, so if you just used your iPod C structure for this, you should have been able to include all the components. And whenever you get a research hypothesis question, it's always good to just write the acronym iPod C right next to the question, so you know which components you need to include so you don't miss out on any. Okay, so this is just the sample answer. It was hypothesized that, so those are our 4 magic words that we use to always start the hypothesis. So it was hypothesized that adults at university who were sleep deprived, and then in brackets having only 5 hours of sleep per night, would show an increased body weight. So increased is just in pink there, or it's in a different color, just to show you guys it's always important to mention what's going to happen to the DV. So we know the DV is the variable that we measure for change, but how is it changing? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What's the hypothesis? So in this experiment, basically the researcher indicates or aims to investigate whether sleep deprivation can contribute to weight gain, and weight gain kind of indicates like an increase in weight. Okay, so that's why I've used the word increase there. Or even if you mention something like will show greater body weight or will show a higher amount of body weight, that's also fine. Okay, and in brackets we've just operationalized that, so as measured by change in body weight in kilograms after 12 months. So these operationalized parts are the same as the previous slide. Compared to, this is the important part a lot of people forget sometimes. So compared to adults at university who maintained a normal sleep time. So these are the guys who are our control group. Okay, these are the people who are not exposed to the IV. So there's no IV for them. In this case, if the IV was sleep deprivation, these are the people who are not going through sleep deprivation. In other words, they are maintaining a normal sleep pattern there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. We've included all of our iPod C components, and so that would get 4 marks there. So that's a good hypothesis. So if you got something similar to that, then good work. If not, just focus on which areas you continue to make mistakes. For example, when I was a student and I was writing hypotheses, the hardest part for me was the operationalizing part. So I had to keep going back, reading the scenario again. So if that's the main issue you're having, just do a few practice questions with research hypotheses. Maybe go back to your Ed Rollo spreads and do those questions, and then just try to build up that skill there. The more questions you do relating to this, the better you get at it generally. Okay, so it's just a matter of practice. All the research method stuff can be hard at first, but if you just do a little bit more practice, then you should get your head around it in no time. Alrighty, so that's the research hypothesis there. So let's keep moving on. Okay, now this is the evaluating the study part. So now you guys basically need to read through this study. It's not a big scenario anyway. Read through this study and identify any unwanted variables. So unwanted variables meaning any extraneous variables or potential confounding variables. And we often classified these as being unwanted because we said they had an unwanted effect on the DV, making it hard for us to determine whether the IV was the actual cause for the behavior. Okay, so remember we said in any ideal experiment, we want the IV to cause the DV. The IV to cause the change in the DV, but sometimes we get these sneaky little variables called extraneous variables and potential confounding variables that make it really difficult for us to actually determine, was it the IV that caused the change in the DV, or was it these other unwanted variables? Okay, so that's the basic thing that I want you guys to pick out from this study. It could be anything, any unwanted variable, and you don't always have to attach a fancy name to it. Even if you're just talking about individual participant difference, you can just give some examples of that. As well as, do you guys think there are any ethical breaches or any ethical issues in terms of participant safety or participant rights? So participant safety and rights. Or any other limitations or weaknesses of the study that you can see in terms of the setup of the study, in terms of how the researcher has conducted the tasks or what the participants are expected to do. So just basically critique this study and criticize this study. That's all this question is asking you to do. And it's worth 4 marks. So try to have at least 3 different points, maybe 1 for each, 1 extraneous potential confounding variable, 1 ethical breach, and 1 limitation, or maybe 2 extraneous, 1 ethical breach, 1 limitation, something like that. So just about 3 to 4 points in total there. So I'll give you guys about 3 minutes now to evaluate this study and write some points there. And your time starts now. Alrighty, so what do we think, guys? What are some examples of variables you came up with? So we can just jot them down before we look at the sample answer. I'll just jot them down on the side here, probably. Just put any variables, even if it's just 1 variable you could think of, just put it down in the chat box and we can discuss. Okay, so stress. Yep, amount of food eaten. Yeah, that's a good one. And diet. Yep, that can influence the weight gain. Yeah, the pre-existing medical conditions. Yep, that's good. And then ethical principles, the no harm principle because of the lack of sleep. Yep, that can harm participants. And limitations, let's see. Use convenience. Yeah, the use of convenient sampling. So the use of convenient sampling doesn't allow for generalization of results there. Good. So there's some really good points. Any other points, guys, that anyone else came up with? So we can just discuss those before we look at the sample answer. Remember, all you're doing here is you're looking at what variables affect weight gain, because weight gain is our DV, obviously. So what variables affect weight gain other than IV? So other than the sleep deprivation, what are other variables that affect weight gain? So just think about what are other variables that can affect someone to put on weight, essentially. Okay, so stress is one, amount of food eaten is one, pre-existing medical conditions is one, and we can even add to this medications. Some people are on certain medications due to illnesses that actually have a side effect of making them gain weight. Okay, so that's a possible one as well. What else can we talk about? What's one activity that people do generally to not gain weight? Yeah. So you could even talk about exercise as well. Okay, so exercise is another one that you can talk about as well. So it's really important to remember that it's any variable that we can link back to having an unwanted effect on weight gain. Okay, so that's really important to remember that that's what an unwanted variable is. Okay, so I'll just show you guys the sample answer. Oops. Okay, these are some examples of sample answers there. Okay, so individual participant differences. So some participants might be more active, okay, which offsets any weight gain effects. Some participants might have a poor diet, which actually exacerbates their ability to gain weight. There's also a pretty large age range. Okay, and that can actually influence people's metabolism levels. Okay, if you're talking about 18 to 40, students who are 18 years old will have a much faster metabolism and gain weight less and be less likely to gain weight than someone who's 40 years old, whose metabolism has slowed down. A limitation of the study is that it doesn't indicate how the researcher is actually monitoring the participants. So obviously the participants might be like, oh yeah, I was sleeping for 10 hours every night, or I was sleeping for 5 hours every night. But how do we actually track that? How do we believe them? So what we could, there are certain things that we could do for that. And we'll talk about that in the next slide when we talk about suggestions for improving the research. The ethical breach of informed consent or withdrawal rights. So the scenario doesn't explicitly state that informed consent was used or that the students were told of their right to withdraw from the study. It's not explicitly indicated in the study. So we can always say that, it wasn't present or that it wasn't apparent there. Okay, and that it possibly could have been breached. This is more of an issue, especially because the university lecturer is using her own students, and it's very easy for her to abuse her power. Like, remember when we did that class experiment and we did that little Freddo experiment in class, and then I didn't really allow anyone to sit out of that. I was like, no, everyone has to be in a, it's all compulsory participation. So it's very easy for me to force you guys to take part, being your teacher. So in the same way, it's very easy for that lecturer to actually force her university students to take part, especially because of that power dynamic, okay, that exists. And that can actually increase the risk of the ethical breach. Also, the ethical breach of no harm principle, which some of you mentioned. Again, this is a pretty long study. You notice it goes for 12 months. So sleep depriving someone for 12 months, is it really safe? It's not really safe at the end of the day. Okay, there is a risk to people's physical and mental health. And over time, sleep deprivation can make you less cognitively efficient. It can make you experience like changes in your physical health. Like when we're sleep deprived, we have higher levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone in our body. There are issues with the regulation of other hormones, like hunger hormones, for example. And so those hormones cause us to overeat, which can have a negative effect on our health as well. Okay, so it does breach the no harm principle. Because it's a very long study and sleep depriving people for that long is never a good idea. So now what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to look at what are the future improvements. So going off the previous slide and going off the different problems or issues we have in this study, how are we going to now fix this? How are we going to control for these variables or minimize the effect of these variables? So just give some practical ideas for at least two of those previous variables that we looked at on the previous slide for how we're going to fix that. Okay, or how are we going to control for that variable if we were to redo this experiment in the future? So I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to work on this question now. Just jot down 2 future improvements you'd make to the study to fix the problems in the previous slide. And your time starts now. Alrighty, so in this question, we're basically using whatever issues we found with the experiment in the previous question and suggesting future improvements for how we can minimize or control the effect of those other variables or other limitations or weaknesses of the study. So you'll notice here, I've given you a range of answers. You only need to really mention 2 for 2 marks. So you can choose any 2 that you that make the most sense to you, I suppose. So when we're looking at this idea that we can control for individual participant differences like age, For example, next time the researcher could maybe choose to take all of her university students aged between maybe 18 to 20 years of age. So maybe just first and second year students. Okay. Or alternatively, choose only her more mature age students that are aged like 30 to 35. Something like that, where the age range or the age gap is not as vast or not as large. Okay. 18 to 40 is a pretty big age range, which actually invites all these individual participant differences. So it's better to have a closer age range or age gap there. Okay, so when we're talking about this idea of, the experimental group and the control group sticking or adhering to their designated sleep schedules, there are many apps that people can actually track their sleep with. In fact, if you've got an Apple Watch or a Fitbit these days, all of those smartwatches have sleep tracking functions. So somehow maybe the researcher can kind of, be able to monitor her participants' sleep habits through an app like that actually tracks sleep. And so that allows her to make sure that her participants are not just lying about whether they're actually having normal sleep or not. The next thing that we need to remember is that the researcher does need to implement clear informed consent procedures, even if they're just her students and it's a very casual relationship or whatever that they're having. She still needs to take the proper formalities, and this is to make sure that there's no instance where she's abusing the power that she has. Okay, to avoid violating the no harm principle, the researcher can make the study not last for 12 months, but maybe only last for about a month or two. Okay, like that would be more practical in terms of a time commitment, and there'd be less risk of people actually dropping out of the study or people actually experiencing physical or psychological harm from the study as a result of that. Okay, so these are just some suggestions, and you could have had different suggestions there. But these are some suggestions. The suggestion you can also add here is that rather than using convenience sampling in the future, maybe we can use random sampling, okay, to ensure that everyone has an equal chance of being selected there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So any two of these points would have got you 2 marks there. Okay, so let's have a look at the next question. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're trying to link back to the results now. So that's why I put the little graph in. So now you're going to answer the question of, was the hypothesis of this experiment supported by the results? Describe why or why not with reference to the specific results obtained, okay, using that graph there. So I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to answer this question. It's pretty straightforward, and your time starts now. Alrighty, so basically when we're looking at this question, was the hypothesis of this experiment supported by the results? First of all, you're going to say yes or no. So it's pretty, I think the answer was pretty obvious. The answer is yes. So you get 1 mark for saying yes, and then 1 mark for justifying that. And it says with reference to the result. So you need to link back to that graph that's on the slide. Okay, so we're saying that this is because, as we can see in the graph, participants in the experimental group, which is this group here, okay, this is our experimental group because they're the ones that are being sleep deprived. So participants in the experimental group who were sleep deprived showed an increase in weight. We said that increase was about 2 kilos when we looked at the y-axis there and the number of kilos gained. So the average increase was about 2 kilos there. Whereas the control group, who has normal sleep patterns, which is this group here, this is the control group, they didn't experience any increase in weight. In fact, they showed a slight decrease in weight, a very slight decrease, but still no increase in weight there. So that indicates to you that yes, the hypothesis was supported and that we can see that reflected in the data that we have. Okay, that's basically that answer there. Whenever you're asked to link back to results, it's always good to indicate or mention the actual result or the actual change in terms of the number. That involves you to interpret the graph. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. Suggest a conclusion for this result based on, suggest a conclusion for this research based on the results. Okay, so just indicate what you think a conclusion could be. And remember, a conclusion is just a summary of what the experiment found in terms of its participants and in terms of the effect of the IV and DV. So just try to indicate all of that in a few sentences, and that'll be your conclusion. So it's worth 3 marks, but it's not actually that much information. So I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to work on this now, and your time starts now. Recording. All right, so when we talk about conclusions, we generally have three specific things that we need to include. And this is at both your year 11 and year 12 level. So for example, in the 2019 VCAA year 12 exam for psychology, there was a question on conclusions, and a lot of students didn't get full marks for that question for the simple reason that they didn't include one thing or the other. So these were the three things that VCA expected that year. Okay, you needed to mention the sample, which is basically the actual participants that were taking part in the study. You could include the number or without the number. They didn't mind. They weren't too fussed about that, but at least the specific participants that were involved. The direction of effect. So you needed to indicate whether there was an increase or a decrease between the IV and the DV, and then the actual relationship between the IV and DV, which is literally you just stating that. And mentioning these three things is not actually that difficult when you actually look at the answer. So the answer is that it can be concluded that healthy adults at university who are sleep deprived for an extended period of time, or we could even say for 12 months, will experience an increase in weight gain compared to healthy adults at university who are not sleep deprived or who had normal sleep time. So you can see that the conclusion is worded in a way that it sounds kind of like a hypothesis, but the hypothesis was more of a prediction that we made, and that was generally made before the study. It's a prediction and it's made before the study, or it's pre-study or pre-experiment. The conclusion is after we've done the study and we've got the results, what can we now conclude with some certainty there that has actually occurred, that we can actually see reflected in the results or the eventual data that we got. Okay, so in any conclusion that you write, it's always going to be worth 3 marks. Okay, and those 3 marks will go for you mentioning the name of the sample, the direction of effect, which is quantifying or explaining the quantity, whether something's increasing or decreasing, as well as a statement of the IV and DV and the relationship between the two. Okay, so that's basically the 3 things you always need to include for a 3-mark conclusion. Okay, so that's basically the conclusion. And I believe this is the last question. So I'll give you guys about probably, let's say 2 minutes to do this one. Okay, and your 2 minutes starts now. So all you're doing for this question is you're saying, is it possible to generalize the results? So just say yes or no, and then indicate why you said yes or no. Okay, so the basic answer for this is no, we can't generalize results. And we already talked a little bit about this before, in the sense that we can't generalize results for a number of reasons. Okay, if you mentioned any of those reasons, then that would be good for your justification. So number 1, we use convenience sampling. So that means that not every person had an equal chance to take part in the study, which means that we've got what we call as a biased sample, okay, rather than a representative sample. So that's why we can't generalize results. Also, there were some ethical breaches with reference to things like the no harm principle. Whenever we feel like our results have harmed participants, we can't generalize results. And that's one of the reasons why, even though Zimbardo's experiment, for example, the Stanford prison experiment we learned about, gave us a lot of insightful information about power and status, he was not able to generalize those results because of the many ethical breaches that he had subjected the participants to. And too many individual participant differences, again, acts as a potential confounding variable, making it difficult for us to determine, was it the IV or was it the potential confounding variable that led to the change in the behavior or in the DV. And so whenever you've got a variable that confounds the results, that can contribute to an inability to generalize those results there. Okay, so that's basically covered our research scenario, and that was the last question. So I'm just going to stop the recording here.